The strongest army in Europe belongs to Ukraine. That's not us saying it, the US has just crowned Ukraine as Europe's strongest military. Putin hates it. He never wanted to hear anything like this. But the reasoning is sound. The future of Europe now rests on Ukraine and, in what has to go down as a nightmare come true for Putin, the US recognition means that Ukraine now holds more cards than ever in peace talks. It was the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio who made the grand proclamations during a May 14th interview with Sean Hannity of Fox News. Sitting on Air Force One as he headed to China alongside other members of the Trump administration, Rubio told Hannity that no other military in Europe comes close to comparing with Ukraine. The Ukrainian armed forces are now the strongest, most powerful armed forces in all of Europe, just to be clear right now, Rubio declared. That's a statement that will send shockwaves through the Kremlin, an acknowledgement of something that Putin never wanted the US to recognize. Rubio provided several reasons why he believes Ukraine is as good as it gets in Europe right now, including the provision of Western military assistance, which we'll get to. But far ahead of that are two factors that Rubio says make Ukraine stronger than everybody else: unrivaled combat experience and an asymmetric approach to war that has redefined everything that we thought we knew about combating Russian aggression. Let's start with the combat experience. Ukraine is stronger, obviously because of a lot of the assistance they've gotten, Rubio said, before adding, but also because of the battlefield experience they've gained. Never underestimate how valuable this hard-earned battlefield experience can be, both for Ukraine itself and the rest of Europe. Most European nations, and certainly those that might be tasked with fending off a future invasion by Russia, haven't fought in active combat for years. Take the UK as an example. The UK's last involvement in a major war was in Afghanistan, in a conflict that lasted between 2001 and 2021. There's no taking away from the heroism that the UK soldiers demonstrated in that war. However, it was a very different fight from what we now see between Ukraine and Russia. Putin's forces don't engage in guerrilla warfare. They push relentlessly as Russia dedicates hundreds of thousands of soldiers to attritional campaigns that force its opponents onto the defensive. The UK hasn't seen anything like that since World War II. The same goes for most of Europe, and most countries in Europe and even in NATO know it. The value that lies in Ukraine's combat experience has been recognized for a long time. Rubio is just the latest, and in the context of Ukraine's relationship with the US, perhaps the loudest voice to proclaim it, but others have said the same kind of thing. For instance, December 2025 saw the Director General of the NATO International Military Staff, Lieutenant General Remigius Baltrinus, praise the contributions that Ukrainian officers have made to helping NATO to improve its collective standards. NATO has plenty of doctrines that dictate how the organization will respond to a war with a nation like Russia. Many of them are still important, especially on the aerial front. However, it's Ukraine that brings the most experience when it comes to dealing with Russia on the ground, Baltrinus said, and NATO has a lot to learn from the nation. Fast forward to 2026, and European leaders are now highlighting how Ukraine's combat experience makes its military the strongest that the continent has to offer. About a month before Rubio made his comments, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz said, "There is no other army in Europe that has had such military experience in recent decades as Ukraine." Merz made those comments as he talked about Germany's interest in coordinating with Ukraine so that Germany could learn more about Ukrainian military structures. Translation: Ukraine knows plenty that Germany doesn't about dealing with a tyrant like Putin. On April 25th, Czech military analyst Colonel Otakar Fultin told UKR Inform that there is no longer any denying Ukraine's position as the best that Europe has to offer. "We already have a European army, and that European army is called the Armed Forces of Ukraine," the colonel said. Keep that mention of a European army in mind because we'll be coming back to it. If the Ukrainian army was able to outperform and stop the Russian army, it means first, that this is already a victory in itself, and second, that the armed forces of Ukraine are the most powerful European army, with the greatest combat experience and the strongest will, Fultin added. That's an interesting final statement. The Czech colonel points out that it's not just Ukraine's experience that makes it the strongest in Europe. An indomitable will is everything, and Ukraine has fought so hard over 4 years because the nation refuses to capitulate to a dictator who wants to see the end of Ukraine. A consensus has been reached. Combat experience lies at the core of Ukraine's strength. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky will think that all of these Jews are a long time in the making. He has long pointed out Ukraine's heroes are key to making the country the strongest in all of Europe, so seeing Rubio, NATO commanders, European heads of state, and analysts all say the same things will be gratifying. Ukraine is now setting about proving that its experience can pay off for others. In the Gulf, around 200 Ukrainian drone experts are working with nations like Saudi Arabia and Qatar to help them defend themselves against the very Shahid-type drones that Russia has been using against Ukraine for years. Ukraine is setting itself up as a key defense partner all around the world, and that's all born from the country's experiences in dealing with Russia. Putin opened Pandora's box when he launched his Ukraine invasion. The box can never be closed, as he has turned Ukraine into the most experienced fighting force in Europe. However, experience, as important as it is, must be accompanied by appropriate tactics, and that's where Rubio says Ukraine has truly excelled, as its soldiers and overall military learn more than any other European nation every day that they're entrenched in their fight against Russia. It's how that learning is used to make adaptations on the battlefield that really make Ukraine as strong as it is. There's no doubt that the necessity of fighting this war has caused the Ukrainians to develop new tactics, new techniques, new equipment, new technology that is creating a sort of hybrid asymmetrical warfare, Rubio declared, before adding, "That's impressive, no doubt about it." And the US Secretary of State isn't wrong. Ukraine has become a hotbed of innovation since Russia launched its invasion, to the point where it's transformed everything anybody thought they knew about defending themselves against a much larger force. Drones, of course, are at the forefront of this transformation. The Gulf nations want to do deals with Ukraine because they know that the interceptor drones that Ukraine has developed offer them a far more cost-effective way of dealing with Iranian Shahid drones and their expensive Western-made air defense missiles. In Ukraine itself, the drone advantage has evolved over time. First, Ukraine modified commercial drones so they could carry small payloads to attack Russian forces. Then those drones kept on getting better. Maritime drones gave Ukraine the ability to attack ships, even though it barely has a navy of its own. Over May 16th to 17th alone, Ukraine used its drones to take out a Russian Coast Guard vessel, alongside 46 other targets, TVP World reports. Russia's Black Sea Fleet found out and continues to see how effective these drones are. A third of the fleet's warships now lie below the waves. In Ukraine and even inside Russia, drones form the core of the asymmetric strategy that Rubio highlights. Ukraine has built kill zones that stretch for dozens of kilometers, which tear up Russian soldiers before they get close to the front. Long-range strikes against Russian military assets and oil, both in the occupied territory and Russia itself, subject Putin's war machine to death by 1,000 cuts. The key to all of this is that Ukraine never stands still, be that with its drones or the many other technologies that it's developed to form the backbone of its asymmetric strategy. As the Center for European Policy Analysis, or CEPA, points out, Ukraine is in the midst of a shift that minimizes the number of soldiers it needs to keep on the front lines. Direct exposure on the front is now making way for data analysis, remote operations, and feats of engineering that no military in Europe ever considered because they didn't need to before now. Drones are now used against between 80 and 85% of the frontline targets that Ukraine has in its sights, CEPA notes. Ukraine will make 8 million drones in 2026 alone, CEPA adds, and it continues to improve on everything that it builds. But there's so much more to Ukraine's asymmetric strategy than drones alone. It's the tech behind these drones, along with other unmanned systems, that's the really impressive part that has taken Ukraine to a new level of European military power. That tech changes everything. And by the way, you are watching The Military Show. If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the perfect time to hit the button so you always catch what's coming up next from our channel. On the tech front, Ukraine has been spearheading the use of artificial intelligence, or AI, in its warfighting. As of April, there are more than 200 companies that are working on AI-related military technologies in Ukraine, the country's defense ministry points out. Those companies are collectively responsible for more than 300 AI-related developments, many involving the incorporation of AI with drones, that are registered on the Brave One platform Ukraine created to support its many innovators. Heck, that platform alone deserves a mention when it comes to Ukraine's asymmetric strategy. Through Brave One, Ukraine provides support and funding to its decentralized defense sector, which in turn ensures that Ukraine doesn't make itself vulnerable to Russian attacks that can wipe out massive portions of its defense industry. Anybody who has a good idea can get the support they need using Brave One. For a nation that thrives on innovation, the clever use of a centralized platform to support decentralized entrepreneurs is a stroke of genius. And there's so much more that we could talk about here. Ukraine's development of ground robotics means that machines are replacing troops on the front lines to handle logistics and, as we saw in April, even capture Russian positions. The interceptor drones that are enjoying so much demand in the Gulf have been a revelation that have helped Ukraine get to the point where it's intercepting almost 90% of the long-range drones that Russia launches into Ukrainian territory every month. Over and over, Ukraine proves itself to be the most powerful European military, not through its development of expensive tech, but due to making cost-effective weapons that work against the threat that Russia poses. And again, the rest of Europe sees the value. Manufacturers, large and small, throughout Europe are now racing to imitate Ukraine's drone development, The Guardian's Jasper Jolly reported on May 10th. He points to a UK-based startup named Skycutter, which makes fuselages for interceptor drones using a row of 3D printers. That sort of business would never have even been a concept without the asymmetric approach to war that Rubio notes. And it's just one example of companies throughout Europe either being inspired by Ukraine or working directly alongside it so they can help their countries get ready for the sort of war that Putin wages. That alone proves that Ukraine's asymmetric approach is of an indescribable level of value to Europe, just as Rubio says. But let's move on to another point that the US Secretary of State made. He points out that part of the reason why Ukraine has become the powerhouse of Europe is the level of military aid that it's received from its partners in the US and on the European continent. Rubio isn't wrong to point this out. According to the Kiel Institute and its Ukraine support tracker, Ukraine has received almost $134 billion in aid from the US, with a further $241 billion coming from Europe, which has also offered another $208 billion in aid that is yet to be allocated. Programs like Pearl exist to enable Ukraine, Europe, and the US to work together to acquire the sorts of Western weapons that Ukraine hasn't been able to make itself. Air defense systems like the Patriot and airframes like the F-16 are the standouts of the Western weapons that Ukraine has received so far. The former due to it being the best system that Ukraine has for dealing with Russia's missile threat, and the latter because it gives Ukraine more options in the air than anything else in its arsenal. But even with this aid, Ukraine still finds ways to display its power. Let's take the F-16s as an example. These aren't new Western airframes. Ukraine is essentially receiving the cast-offs from nations that have upgraded to other fighter jets. That isn't meant to be a knock. Ukraine values its F-16s. But that combat experience we talked about earlier comes to the fore, as Ukraine is showing the West that even its outdated platforms still have value. Back in December 2024, just a few months after Ukraine received its F-16s, one of the country's pilots achieved a world first by shooting down 6 cruise missiles in a single sortie. That's a sort of feat that can only be achieved by a nation that is focused on making its military the best that Europe has. Ukraine has also adapted to incorporate low-altitude flight into its F-16 sorties, which goes against every standard NATO doctrine that exists. Why? Again, it's all about adaptation. Flying high makes Ukraine's Western jets vulnerable to Russian air defenses, but flying low allows Ukraine to use its F-16s to conduct strikes while minimizing the risks that its airframes face. It's another rewriting of the traditional rulebook that comes from Ukraine. Innovation combined with experience, whether that be with brand new weapons or Western-supplied equipment, that's what makes Ukraine the strongest military in Europe. And before we move on, we're going to point out one more way that Ukraine is stronger than every other European nation. Rubio didn't cover this one, but it's important. Ukraine has the largest active military in Europe, after Russia. According to Statista, Ukraine has 900,000 active personnel in its military. That's still a long way behind Russia's 1.32 million active personnel. But when it comes to military strength in what you might call its purest form, Ukraine is well ahead of any other army in Europe. Size matters when dealing with Russia, even if a nation has created asymmetric tactics that allow it to fight an even harder battle than it could through sheer manpower alone. Even if Ukraine is forced to reduce the size of its army to 600,000 soldiers, as was proposed in a 28-point peace plan proposed by the US toward the end of 2025, Ukraine would still have an army that is twice the size of Turkey's, which has the next largest army in Europe behind Ukraine and excluding Russia. Gel combat experience, asymmetrical genius, and Western weapons with an army of that size and you get a legitimate European superpower. We mentioned peace talks just now. You may remember that we touched on those talks in the introduction of the video, where we said that the US acknowledging Ukraine's strength is a nightmare for Putin when it comes to negotiating. Those negotiations aren't going as well as Rubio and the US would like. During his discussion with Hannity, Rubio pointed out that talks seem to have slowed down, but he also made a couple of other interesting comments. The president just wants to see the war end. He thinks it's a crazy war, and he's right, Rubio said of US President Donald Trump's efforts to negotiate peace. You have people dying in massive numbers on both sides. Ukraine is going to spend 2 decades rebuilding. The damage to the Russian economy is extraordinary. Adding to this, Rubio pointed out that Russia is losing between 15,000 and 20,000 soldiers per month. Those soldiers aren't getting injured, Rubio pointed out. They're dying as Russia endures losing 5 times as many soldiers a month as Ukraine in the war. These comments matter for a very simple reason. They show Putin that he can't manipulate the US into believing that Ukraine is weaker than it actually is. In attempting to gain leverage in peace talks, Putin spent much of 2025 using misinformation to cast Russia as an all-conquering force against tiny Ukraine. At times, the manipulation appeared to be working. In December, Trump declared that Ukraine was losing the war against Russia, even though Russia only managed to steal about 1% of Ukraine's territory in a year that saw it lose an estimated 415,000 soldiers. That's not winning a war, it's crawling along while hoping you can negotiate a peace deal that isn't reflective of what's really happening on the battlefield. Putin tried to foster a narrative that simply didn't exist. Now Rubio has come out to say that Ukraine has the strongest army in Europe. That narrative has been shattered. That's why the words coming out of the mouth of the US Secretary of State are such a nightmare for Putin. Even now, as he talks about foreseeing an end to the invasion he started, Putin has to face up to the fact that he can't pull the wool over American eyes anymore. The nation that has cast itself as the chief mediator in peace talks now knows, without a shadow of doubt, that Ukraine isn't the weak nation that Putin tries to cast it as. Ukraine is strong, stronger than any other nation in Europe, and the US recognizes it. The next time his delegates are at the table, they won't be able to argue for the inevitability of a Ukrainian loss. Rubio and his compatriots see through it. They see the damage being done to Russia's economy. They see the scale of death and how Ukraine has beaten Russia in casualties. And they see Ukraine's military, the asymmetric beast that has developed into an army that is central to all of Europe's security. The cards are no longer in Putin's hands. And as for Ukraine's strength, it's starting to pay off. We see that in the US assessment and everything that Ukraine is doing to make itself a key defense partner to European and Gulf nations. But even in Ukraine itself, the strength is showing itself. In Crimea, Putin is watching as a bad situation gets worse and worse. What was supposed to be Putin's stronghold has become his ultimate weakness, as the powerful Ukrainian military enacts its plan for the liberation of its stolen peninsula. Find out more by watching our video, and if you enjoyed this video, remember to subscribe to The Military Show so you don't miss any of our upcoming content. And thank you for watching.